Hi. In this presentation, I'm going to be going over the details of your assignment that is due. I'd prefer to get it, if you can send a picture to me on March 23rd, but let's say no later than the 24th. This is kind of an important assignment that I was going to go over in class together, so I'm going to try to do the same thing I would have done in class, but with pictures. And again, don't feel stressed about this assignment. It's an important assignment for you to understand what we're doing in this class. But it's not going to be graded heavily against you. So you're just going to do your best, and there's not really a wrong way to do this assignment. Or even kind of more specifically, if you do it quote unquote wrong, I will let you know. So we're going to learn something called actor network theory today, and this comes from science in particular, but something called cybernetics, which sounds like a really super fancy thing. But really, if you think about like automation, if you think about your computer, if you think about your cell phone, how your operating system works, these are all kind of under the same theory. So all we're really doing is applying a theory within science to the field of political science or criminal justice or legal studies, right? It doesn't really matter what phrase we're using because we're just really kind of creating a structure first so that we can analyze things. So I'm calling this a slight correction to the method of science, and what we mean by this is the scientific method, right? And so I assume you learned that at some point in your life, but if you didn't, right, you'll remember it's just you're putting up a hypothesis, you're going to set up your laboratory or your structure of some kind, like you're going to go to the playground and watch children interact with each other so that you have something to say about how social relations are formed. You might look at a bunch of statistics and say, okay, this percentage of people is in jail for this crime, therefore. So basically all you're doing is you say, I think the world operates this way. You take some set of information and then you analyze it under that principle. Almost always you're going to have to revise your hypothesis. The problem that we're going to get at, and I'm going to say this a couple times, but the problem that we get at is that oftentimes our hypothesis is extremely biased on things that have no basis in science, that there's no finding. So we might say, well, people are people, right? And that's not really what when we say that, we're not saying that like people are people, right? Like we're not saying people equal people. We're saying like, oh, well, people are just going to do what they're going to do. Well, we don't have any scientific information about that, right? We're not really making any kind of scientific claim there. What we are doing is making what you're going to learn later is called an ideological claim. We think things are one way, and so we extend that out into the world and think everyone else behaves that way too. And this is just wrong. And so what we want to do is try to restrain that or constrain that way of thinking. So there's three principles in network theory that we're going to be using in this class very specifically. So the first one is we need a sturdy theoretical commitment. In other words, we can't just like make these blanket statements and expect them to be true. We need some kind of like theory that we can apply that's going to be strong, that's going to be sturdy and that we can commit to. So we start with kind of a really basic commitment here, is that no space is irreducible. In other words, I can't just artificially claim that some set of relations or some geographical space can be limited in some way. And the reason I can't do that is that I just don't know. And so the easiest way I can kind of explain this is a way that it was explained to me. If you take like your pet, right, or just like look out the window and look at a bird, right? If you look at a bird, you look at a cat, you look at a dog, you look at a lizard, you look at a fish, right? You have a mental model. You have an image in your head of what you think that object is, but you don't know anything about what it's like to be that object. So we can't reduce what it's like to be a cat simply based on what our mind tells us we see or perceive about that cat. So this is like our whole structure here. The reason why we're doing this is that we don't want to make assumptions or predictions or claims about things that we don't know anything about. The second idea here is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to think about this idea about actors, right? That's why it's called actor network theory. And so what we're thinking about is that the people, and it's not always people, but for most of our work, it'll be people. People will kind of like, literally, they physically go from one place to another. So if you look at this image down below, these are migration patterns throughout the world. So the big kind of blue dots and the red dots, right? These are centers where they're kind of congregating. Now, I think like this is an interesting time. And so if you look at this map, guess what? These are also centers where you're having large outbreaks of the coronavirus. Now, notice what's not on this list is like on the left-hand side, if you look over here, right? This is Seattle and this is China, right? So China, they're not really heading this way, and this is for pretty obvious reasons, airlines and whatnot. Folks are heading into these major centers, right? So when you see that this is Europe, right? But when you see that like Turkey, Iran, and then you have Europe, right? And then you come to New York, into the DC area, and then you go up to Canada, right? These are the points in which the virus is traveling. Well, no kidding, right? Because these are the points of which people travel, right? And so this is like the idea is that employed entities, right? So humans, it could also be animals, it could also be goods, right? It could be shoes, right? They move within a structure. Okay, so this is also why we can't really reduce the structures, because we need to follow these actors within these institutions. This also assumes, and it's correctly assumes, that people use tools for a reason, right? So I use a ship to get from one place to the other. I use an airplane to get from one place to the other. I use the courthouse to file a lawsuit or to defend myself, right? So this is the kind of idea we want to think, is that people move and they have some intent when they're moving. So this is both an argument and an examination of the structure and the constraints within that structure. Okay, so I'm not expecting you to fully understand this concept right now. I just need you to remember these three things. So in your notes at home, right, you would take a picture with your phone, or you would write this down, that these are kind of our three main rules that we want to think about, and this is why we're doing this. Okay, this is something you want to get into the habit of doing as you move forward in your academic career, assuming you want to do well. So now we're going to apply this idea. Okay, so if you think about, like, which I'm sure you've never thought about because you didn't have good reason to think about it, which is why I'm making you think about it now. Let's take the ideology of Kingsborough, which is right here, right? Dreams begin here. This is, of course, not true, right? You had dreams before you got to Kingsborough. But Kingsborough is trying to make it like I'm right. Kingsborough is trying to make it that they are the entry point to this like life you're going to lead. So let's follow this concept, right? So you get to Kingsborough, and let's say you get to those big gates, right? And you see this sign, and okay, great. Then now we have a different kind of a map. This is the infrastructure, the institutions that are on Kingsborough's property, okay? Now here, this one is interesting because it's about water bottle refilling station. This is going to become important because what do actors mostly move about the structure or the network for? It's for basic needs. And so if you think about this as saying like, okay, so in order for you to be successful at Kingsborough, you need to be able to have your basic needs met. And so here's a map that kind of tells you the network of human beings that will provide those basic needs, in this case, water. If we then connect that to a larger concept, okay, so then Kingsborough is in this area here, okay, next to the hospital. And then it's part of a larger community in which there's residential properties. Now, these residences pay taxes that go to the city government, and that funds the institution partially. The city, right, Brooklyn in this case, the borough, is part of the larger city, right? And here you see the financial center, which generates income and sends it to the boroughs. It sends it to the institution and to the community, and sends it to the structure, and then sends it to this idea. This is how the dreams begin. So if you're an actor, you're a student, then you're going through this structure, but you never really think about it. You don't think about all of the other actors within the structure itself. So I'm listing these actors here. So I think the one you think of the most is the faculty, but the faculty have chairs of our department. So that's kind of like our boss. And then they report to a larger group of faculty called the College Council. But then we also have our lived experience. So we have families, we have workplaces, we have our blocks, we have our communities, right? And you can kind of keep going with this idea, right? That we have this whole like story about us that also come into this network. Then we have places on the campus that kind of organize these stories, right? So we have the Student Union Intercultural Center, which is the SUIC, which I'll refer to later. There's the Men's Center, there's the Women's Center, there's Student Life, there's other student clubs, etc. And so these are places where lived experience is kind of valued, right? And so actors bring their lived experience and they talk about it there. But again, they don't necessarily connect back to faculty. Sometimes they do. They certainly don't connect back to the chairs or the college council. And so they're all required. They're all part of the network, but they don't necessarily remember that we're part of this. We can then go into the staff, right? And the staff is enormous at Kingsborough. And then these are some of the major areas that would affect you as a student: academic affairs, student affairs, the provost, the deans, the vice presidents, the grounds crew, the public safety people, the food service people. So all these people are necessary and they're part of the network. But again, you don't always see these interactions. You don't see these lived experiences that these individuals bring. They then all report to the president of the institution, who has a chief of staff. And these two human beings are really in charge of kind of like maintaining the entire network. Okay, so they're kind of like the service or the maintenance people. They then report out to the local governments, right? The local city council, the larger NYC government, and then the city council, the larger city council, and then also the mayor. So they kind of have relationships that we don't always see. Sometimes these individuals are brought onto campus, but there's lots of interchanges, there's lots of emails, there's lots of meetings, there's lots of phone calls, right, in which these individuals meet with each other that we don't see, but we are affected by. That group then reports to the Board of Trustees. And that's a larger group of people. That includes business people, political people, healthcare people, right? So you've got all these different, you've got lawyers, right? You've got all these different people that are then influencing the network at an even higher level. Those people report to the New York State government, the legislature, and the Governor Cuomo himself. And so now you have like this extra layer, and these people have probably less influence over the day-to-day operations, but they have major influence over the policy, over your financial aid, over what kind of money comes to the institution to fix the T buildings, for example. Then those individuals report to the federal government, including the Secretary of Education and the President of the United States. Now, Donald Trump is very far removed from the day-to-day operations way back here at Kingsborough. However, there's many things that he could do that could bring lots of money to the institution. There's lots of decisions he could make about financial aid, about student loans, etc. And so these are kind of, again, people that influence the structure of the system, even though we don't necessarily always think about them. So this is kind of like what an actor network looks like at a very large scale, just at Kingsborough. Now we're going to go to a much smaller scale, and I'm going to give you an example of my own actor network map that I've just created. Okay, so I don't think it's like super complicated here, but I'm going to begin with myself, right? So Jason Leggett, this is my individual, and this is what you're going to do, is just create yourself, and you're obviously at the center of the map. Now we're going to trace, like, what was the reason for me moving to this particular neighborhood? Well, I need to be close to John Jay. I go there quite often. There's a lot of criminal justice stuff or Justice Academy stuff that I need to go to, and so I wanted to be close to this institution because I spent a lot of time there. There's also a lot of research stuff that I have to do there as well. But I also need to go to the CUNY Graduate Center, right? So one's kind of like really near my house, the other one I have to walk a little bit, but they're both relatively close. And this is for my career. These are the things I need to do in order to progress and be a good professor, etc. Now, obviously, I'm picking like the thing that I care about the most, right, which is groceries, right? So just before I made this, I had to go to the store to get some more groceries. And there's two grocery stores that are, two different directions. So I want to include both of those because it's interesting how I make the distinction and how I choose. Then as a professor, right, as an educator, I have to go to Staples. Staples is in my neighborhood. That's a convenience. That's something that I would, use on a pretty regular basis. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to go to the bar and food, right? Can't do this right now, which is, devastating, not just to me, but also to the people who, have to work there. This is also true of like a coffee shop. And so there's, different people that I'm going to interact with that I need to, be friendly with, or that I need to exchange information with, and probably more importantly in those last three, exchange money, right, to keep kind of the economy circulating. Then there's MTA, right? I'm going to use this on a fairly regular basis, and this is to get down to Kingsborough. But Kingsborough isn't the only place that I use MTA or the travel network for, so I'm going to create kind of a secondary loop, and I also sometimes have to go to the eye doctor, and I have to go to the dentist. Luckily, I haven't had to go to the other doctor, to the general doctor, but this would be on this network as well. I'm not including that doctor because I haven't quite, haven't used them since I've lived in this neighborhood. So I'm not 100% sure where I'd go. So you kind of get a good idea of like, this is a basic network and this is what I'm kind of asking you to do. And then you could start to think of like, what are the services that I may need in the future? So something about like fire. It happens to be in the same area as the bar and food. Might think about healthcare, right? Or police. So police happens to be in the same area as John Jay College. Healthcare happens to be in the same area as both of those as well. So here you see I've constructed a map that basically tells me different places that I can go, and these are all within my kind of network. And the main point I want you to think about is there's humans in here, but there's also animals. For me, I have pets. I think you can hear one in the background right now. And so that's like a secondary level. That's something that I have to do from time to time. There's also the post office, which I don't use too often, but it is, something that is, necessary from time to time. And so I'd put that in my network as well. Now, this doesn't have to include everything, but these are as many things as I can kind of think of, at the moment. This is all I'm really asking you to do at first. So now I want to explain a little bit more, just to add a little bit different level of complication to this. So this is really a story map, and this is the idea is that can I construct a story about my life using these locations, people, and exchanges? Well, of course, because I had a story kind of before I got to this neighborhood. So I picked two pictures here that kind of just showed two different points that led to this kind of reality. So one is on the bottom hand, it's me and my sister at the beach, right? And so I have a family, right? And so I grew up in a different place. I grew up, in Seattle, which is near the beach, right? So that might influence like how I think about things. That might influence how I respond to a network. That might influence how I talk to people, etc. Then above that, I used to work for a year as an elementary school volunteer, and I worked with a lot of different students in that environment, and so that was a very informative time for me. That kind of gave me a certain set of skills, very specific training, and it gave me a multitude or a multiplication of interactions in which I learned how to think about education from different points of view and at very different ages. So if you start to think about like that network I created, then you're thinking about like people, and that includes the number of people, the skills that those people need in order to exist in the network, the training that we would all require in order to be more efficient or more productive or better for the social good, and then all the interactions that kind of follow from this structure of relationships. So if we just took something like fire, we'd think about, okay, what are the response times necessary in this network? Like how quickly would the fire department need to respond to an emergency? What are the routes that they would take? Which streets would they take? Which streets would they avoid? Where are pedestrians, etc.? And then what are the risk factors, right? Are there some buildings that are more likely to catch fire than others? Is the fire department aware of that? Is that something I can kind of, contribute to? Is there a map online? Is there city services, kind of, etc.? Moving down, I think about, well, what about my basic needs, right? So where are my basic needs within this network? What is the exchange of information that exists, right? I mean, right now, there's lots of information being exchanged. To be honest with you, a lot of it is false information or misinformation, but it's interesting anyways, right? People are talking to each other in a different way than they were, say, 3-4 weeks ago. And so it's interesting to think about in this network. And then a large part of my network is now shut down, right? The coffee shops are shut down, the bar and food is shut down, even the pet store near my house is shut down. So these exchanges of information are like half of what they would have been otherwise. But that also goes for the relationships. I had friends at each of these, at each of these locations, and so now they're in some other network. So we're still related to one another, and we exchange information over text and over, the internet. But we're now not physically in the same network. So that's something interesting to think about. Obviously, travel and extended care and workplace have been radically changed within this network. So now I'm communicating with you over the internet, and we've been instructed not to go to Kingsborough at all. The extended care, like the eye doctor and the dentist, I'm going to have to rearrange those appointments that I was going to have in the upcoming months, right? And then travel, right? We're supposed to be limiting our travel altogether. So this is an interesting part of the Actor Network that 2 months ago was absolutely essential, and now is almost irrelevant. So you want to think about also like what were the things that led me to this network in the first place? Well, it's all for my career, the thing that I'm trying to do, right? And you're kind of in the same boat. You're going to school and you're going to build like a network that's going to get you close to your career. So the things that matter to me were the events, and those are at John Jay and at the Graduate Center. A lot of my meetings are at the Graduate Center. The library services that I need to use and the tech services that I need to use are largely at John Jay. I study a lot at the Graduate Center and at the New York Public Library, and then I conduct my research at each of these institutions. So we want to ask like two other questions. Does the network constitute, maintain, and manage laws, right? And so this is kind of a strange question probably to you at the beginning, but by the end of the semester it won't be. Well, the answer is yes, it does, but I think we want to start thinking about, does it do it well, right? And so some networks are better at constituting, maintaining, and managing laws than others. And so you want to think about in your network, how well do you constitute, how do you participate, how do you create the laws and the rules? How do you maintain those rules? And how do you manage those rules? Many of you don't. And so I want you to think about that. It could be obvious if you look at this map that John Jay College of Criminal Justice or of Justice, right, does a good job of constituting, maintaining, and managing the law. The Graduate Center probably does a fairly good job, but not necessarily as good as John Jay, simply because John Jay has so many people that are knowledgeable about law in that institution. And so we're all sharing information about that law. We all go to these places in this network, and so we're exchanging a large amount of information. We have positive relationships with the police and the fire department. I know that's not true in every network. So you might want to think about why this network has better relationships than others. There's a high level of exchange of information about law as a tool that travels through this network. So that's the question I'm really trying to get you to think about once you've constructed your network. Like, think about, how does the information about law as a tool, right, for you, for social groups, right, for other people, how does this work within this network? Okay, so I could get into a lot of details here, and I've had lots of conversations with folks at the grocery store about labor laws. I've had lots of conversations at the coffee shop about what they're going to do with their unemployment insurance claims. Same thing with the bar and food, about different workplace harassment situations. So if I'm not in that network, the information changes differently. So that's the same thing for you. If you weren't in that network, the information would be exchanged differently. Just something to think about, and this is like where we're going with this. So I'm going to give you two pieces of information just to think about. The bulk, right, the majority of what I'm getting from this comes from a book called Modes of Existence by science philosopher Bruno Latour. And he does a lot of work in trying to bring these different disciplines together in what are called domains. But there's really no such thing as the domain of science, law, religion, economy, criminal justice, sociology, right? These are essentially made up words in ways that we've created networks, right? So criminal justice is a network of people thinking about crime and justice, right? Political science is a network of people thinking about the politics of science, or the science of politics, depending on, you know, which side of the coin you're on. Same thing with like lawyers, right? There's lawyers who practice. There's lawyers like myself who do scholarly research. There's lawyers who they practice, but they don't represent people, right? They represent corporations, right? So there's lots of different kind of like ways of thinking about this, but these are all networks that associate, and they're elements of practice, right? The things that they do within those networks that are borrowed from other networks and then redistributed in new ways throughout multitude of networks. So my network talks to your network talks to another network, etc. So if we follow like one case, right? So let's say somebody just wants to be focused on the science side of this, and somebody comes up with a new patent to come out with this new treatment for coronavirus. You know, you can watch YouTube and see Donald Trump talking about this a lot. And so let's say that this is true. This is the normal situation, is that she'd have to then go through the patent itself, right? So we use the patent as like a legal instrument or a tool. You file the application for a patent that's going to go to the United States Patent Office in the federal government. And then she's going to go to the laboratory where the scientific discovery is created, where they're making this I'm really struggling with what to call it. Let's just call it a treatment, right? It's not a cure, right? So, but it's the treatment for the coronavirus, where they're constructing this, where they're creating this in their laboratory. Then we're going to follow them to the lawyer's office, where they're going to fill out this paperwork, ask a bunch of questions, right? Pay the money, all these things that happen. Then that person's going to go to the board of trustees, and they're going to get approval for this, say like, okay, what's our liability? This is a big issue that keeps coming up in the news that Trump gets very upset about, is what's the liability? What if this drug ends up killing people? This is something that the board of trustees would think about. Then it goes to the bank, right? So they can get the proper funding to put out the money to actually distribute this new treatment. And then it goes to the courthouse for a variety of reasons: to file the patent, if to defend it. What if somebody else also wants to have the patent? Who's going to win? Right? And so this kind of keeps going on through the networks. And what you see here is that we just picked one thing, the legal patent, as the vehicle. We could pick a workplace harassment claim. We could pick a traffic accident. We could pick any vehicle, a tool that takes us through the networks to see what are all the different components, what are the people, what's the skill set, what's the training that's required for this network. This is the big picture, so I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this. I just want you to see this is where we're going. Some of you really like to know where we're going. This is where we're going. We want to see what is the actor network within the field of law. So very simple. You're just going to do the same thing I did. You're just going to draw your map, okay? And again, you can't do this wrong, right? This is like, what is your existence? What is your day-to-day? How does this work for you? That would be your map, okay? So I think you could do this. All you have to do is like just get out a piece of paper, draw out your map, take a picture, email it to me at this address, okay, and do this by March 24th. This is your next step. All right, thanks, guys.